In the case of Cruzan versus the Director of Missouri Department of Health, the family of Nancy Cruzan challenged the Missouri Department of Health on the ability to remove their daughter, Nancy, off of life support after she was declared to be in a permanent vegetative state after being in a car crash. This case occurred in 1983 in the state of Missouri and is a civil liberties case. The main argument of this case was whether or not the 14th Amendment allowed for Nancy's parents to exercise her right to refuse life-sustaining medical treatment. The court ruled that while individuals enjoyed the right to refuse medical treatment under the Due Process Clause, incompetent persons were not able to exercise these rights. Thus, clear and convincing evidence that Nancy desired her treatment to be terminated would be needed to allow the Cruzans to take Nancy off of life support. Since the decision to end Nancy's life was irreversible, and the Supreme Court could not be sure that families would always make decisions in the best interest of the patient, they sided with the state of Missouri in an act of preserving human life. This was a landmark case because it was the first time the U.S. Supreme Court entered into the debate surrounding the right to die argument. They concluded that the state, in the interest of safeguarding human life at all costs, may overrule relatives and medical professionals on specific human life issues.
In the case of Lawrence v. Texas, the petitioners John Lawrence and Tyron Garner were caught having homosexual sex in their Houston home and were arrested. The respondent was the state of Texas. This case challenged a Texas law that criminalized homosexual intercourse. Lawrence claimed that it violated the right to privacy from the 14th Amendment. The date of the decision by the Supreme Court was on June 26, 2003, and the case was originated in Houston, Texas. This was a civil liberties case because it challenges the right to privacy and being able to do whatever you want in your home. Arguments of the case were of the idea of criminalizing homosexual sex but not heterosexual sex violates the 14th Amendment. The Supreme Court ruled that Texas law making it a crime for two people of the same sex to engage in intimate sexual activity violated the Due Process Clause. This is a landmark case because Lawrence and Garner v. Texas resulted in a landmark ruling for gay rights in America. The decision overturned the 1986 Bowers v. Hardwick ruling in which the court upheld Georgia's sodomy law in a case of similar circumstances, ended sodomy laws in the United States.
In the case of Roe v. Wade, Roe, the petitioner, was a pregnant single woman looking to obtain an abortion. After being denied an abortion by Texas state law, she filed her lawsuit against Henry Wade, Dallas District Attorney. The case originated in Dallas, Texas, in January of 1973, and challenged a Texas law that prohibited abortions during the first trimester, or the first 3 months, of pregnancy, except in situations where the mother's life was threatened. The case falls under civil liberties because it has to do with the rights of an individual. The main arguments of this case were that Roe claimed that though her life was not endangered by having her baby, she could not afford to travel out of state and had a right to terminate her pregnancy in a safe medical environment. The court ruled that Texas law violated Jane Roe's constitutional right to privacy, and thus ruled that the states were forbidden from outlawing or regulating abortion performed during the first trimester of pregnancy, and they could only enact abortion regulations reasonably related to maternal health in the second and third trimesters, and could only enact abortion laws protecting the life of the fetus in the third trimester. This was a landmark case because it ended laws making abortions illegal in many states. Roe v. Wade was also one of the first cases to challenge abortion laws for women's rights. It paved the way for many more cases about abortion. In the case of Webster v. Reproductive Health Services, the petitioner was William L. Webster and the Attorney General of Missouri, while the respondent was the Reproductive Health Services. This case occurred in Missouri, and the final ruling was made July 3rd of 1989. The case has to do with the state of Missouri limiting government funds and workers from performing abortions due to the fact that Missouri laws declared that life begins at conception, and fetuses should be given the same rights as all other people. This case falls under the topic of civil liberties because it is infringing on personal rights, but the discrepancy is whether or not the government should be able to interfere with these certain rights. The main arguments of this case were 1. Constitutional boundaries on the limitations of public funding, 2. The effect of and the constitutionality of legislation declaring that life begins at conception, and 3. The ability of a state to require a physician to perform tests and to make and record findings when determining viability. The Supreme Court ruling upheld Missouri's restrictions on access to abortion because refusing government funds and workers doesn't violate the Constitution. This was a landmark case because it narrowed the Supreme Court's holding on the landmark case Roe v. Wade of 1973. By modifying the trimester analysis under which the constitutionality of abortion regulations had been evaluated during the intervening 16 years.
In Planned Parenthood v. Casey, the petitioner was Planned Parenthood of Southeastern Pennsylvania, and the respondent was Robert P. Casey, Governor of Pennsylvania. It was challenged that because of the Due Process Clause of the Constitution, the 1988 and 1989 amendments to the Pennsylvania abortion law were illegal. Planned Parenthood v. Casey took place in Washington, D.C., and the date of the decision was June 29th of 1992. This topic falls under civil liberties because it has to do with abortion, which is an argument of personal rights. Planned Parenthood argued that the regulations imposed by the state of Pennsylvania were unconstitutional under Roe v. Wade. These regulations were 1. Doctors had to inform women of what could go wrong during abortions. 2. Women were required to give prior notice to their husbands of their abortion. 3. Minors were required to have parental consent of their abortion or court consent in special cases. 4. It required a 24-hour waiting period for an abortion. 5. It imposed certain reporting mandates of facilities. And the Supreme Court affirmed that they said in Roe v. Wade that it was unconstitutional for states to make abortion illegal. They ruled that it was a constitutional right for the state to regulate abortions for women's health, and that regulations that impose a burden preventing a woman from obtaining a legal abortion is an undue burden that violates the Constitution. They also ruled that the aspect of a spouse's consent was unconstitutional, but all the other regulations were. This is a landmark case because it reaffirmed the power of Roe v. Wade, but also set the precedent that the Supreme Court could challenge the constitutionality of state regulations.